Welcome to Primal Perspective. My name is Ben Sanford and I'll be your guide today. In this series, I'm having conversations with my friends, colleagues, and teachers who have valuable and unique perspectives to share with the world. By exploring topics from a primal perspective, we can reveal the principles, processes, and patterns of nature which enhance any practice and can give us insight into our lives. This month at Tribal Edge, our focus is on the zone or flow state, and I had the privilege of talking with my teacher and friend, Dr. John Vervaeke from Toronto University. John is an expert in flow state. He's a cognitive scientist, cognitive psychologist and philosopher, and martial artist, and just a joy to talk to. And so we covered a lot of ground. We talked about pretty much everything in the north part of our curriculum, from combat, martial arts, to learning, mentoring, flow, and even more. So I hope you enjoy this video and hope you check out John's YouTube channel with his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. Really profound offering. And now, John Vervaeke.
Alrighty. Cool. Well, thanks again for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah. So I just maybe just to kind of set the context. As I mentioned, our theme in our curriculum this month is basically flow. It's a course I call the zone, and it's this whole season actually is in the area of, in our curriculum, it's basically we focus on the zone, combat, and mentoring. And so
right.
It's kind of hard to explain how those relate really quickly, but they're all part of what we call the north direction of our curriculum. So anything in that area would be, I have tons of questions for you, obviously, but anything in that area would be amazing. So,
well, I'm happy to talk about that stuff. So that's great.
Cool. And then I had a couple other questions that maybe I can weave in there somehow, or just might even start with them just because I might not include it in the actual recording part. But anyway, one thought I had was, I have kind of been arriving at through your work, which, by the way, continues to be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, the language, and I'm slowly getting this this education through your material. And so I'm not academically trained. I kind of arrived at this through a bottom-up approach, and it's amazing to me that the things that are resonating, and I feel like I can kind of understand and stay connect with without having, I'm kind of filling in the gaps. I'm following the resources, and I'll go, quickly read up on something, but it's at the same time, there's this experiential level of getting some of these deeper concepts that is just so powerful and so validating. So
glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that.
So maybe to induce a little flow in our conversation, to make it more of a conversation. I mean, I'm glad to just interview you as well, but if we could focus on, like, I'm not going to be able to hang with you on the academic philosophy level, but
that's fine. That's fine, Ben.
But I can. The other areas I was thinking about is, through experientially through flow experience, but also martial arts. Was another I think cross section that we have that would be really neat to kind of get into.
Sure.
Have you had any interviews with specifically in martial arts much?
Yeah, I've had a couple. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I gotta find those. So anyway, so one of the things, I got a little bit of notes here. Maybe, one thing I wanted to bring up before I forget is your distinction between the language of training and the language of explaining has been very, very useful. and especially in teaching.
Mm.
And something that's occurred to me, especially in the martial arts field, is, and I think it's other places as well, is basically a distinction between, I don't know if it's the language of learning and the language of application, or
Mm.
the,
Mm.
because often in martial arts there's a big disconnect between training and real life, right?
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
I'm
Transfer.
very curious about some of the ways of representing more accurately the usefulness of education, I guess, when it comes to application, if that
Sure.
makes sense. So that's something I've been trying to figure out how to communicate in a better way. I'm getting some big insights in that, but so that's just in the background. We might come back to that.
Okay. I mean, that whole idea about, I've been talking about that in some other discussions I've been having about transfer appropriate processing. I mean, I understand the application to real life self-defense situations, but and I can save your life and it can save the life of other people. So that application I think is important, but that's not the one that is of my primary interest. So I want to relate a story I've related elsewhere, but because I think this is a very important point, and maybe it's a good point to start with.
Okay.
So I've been doing Tai Chi Chuan, and I use this term in both senses of the meaning. Been practicing it religiously for about 3 years. I was in grad school at the time, and and I was getting a lot of it. I would get into the flow state. I'd go through the where the weeks where you were just burning hot, and then the weeks where you're just absolutely cold, and all that stuff, and all this stuff's happening, and right. And so I was getting a lot out of it, but something happened to me that really really struck me. And my friends came up to me, and they didn't know I was doing this, by the way, because they were in grad school. It was, and they said they came up to me and they said, what's happening with you? What's going on? And and when you're in grad school, you have the imposter syndrome. Everybody's going to find out that you really don't belong there, right? Oh no, what is it? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you're different now. You like when you're writing and when you're arguing, you're more balanced and you're more open and you're more flexible. And I thought, oh, and I realized, oh wow, this stuff is permeating my life and percolating through my psyche in ways that I'm not directly aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is that. So if you'll allow me, we can talk about two ways in which we can consider application. One is martial application, but one is existential application. Now, obviously, I hope for the first, it's been there for me when I needed it under that, and I don't want to talk about that. But the existential application to me is really important. And now this connects to flow in an important way, because one of the issues that's around flow is exactly the framing of your flow experience such that it will have existential application. The problem with many of our flow induction practices, video games are a pertinent example. Not all video games, I'm going to be clear about that, but very many video games get you to flow within a frame that does not permeate your life and does not percolate through the psyche. In fact, it leads to video game addiction, it leads reciprocal narrowing, and you get locked down. And one of the things I was comparing in my mind is video game flow induction and Tai Chi Chuan flow induction, and the way Tai Chi Chuan flow induction had that existential application. It was permeating my life, it was percolating through my psyche. And so the question I'm thinking about a lot right now is, okay, what do we do to make sure that we are framing the flow experience such that it has existential application? You and I have both been to kick and punch schools, right, that do not do that. I'm even suspicious that they're not particularly good for the martial application, but that's neither here nor there for what I want to talk about right now. What they clearly fail in, the kick and punch schools, is the existential application. And I'm reminded of the fact that philosophia, Socrates and Plato means broad shoulders because he was a wrestler. It was assumed that you were always doing gymnastics as well as doing philosophia, right? And this is something I've been talking, with Rafe Kelly about and other people. So I would like to, explore with you a bit. Ask the questions you want to ask by all means, Ben. But this idea of existential application, the framing of flow, and what that has to do with the connections, to the cultivation of virtue and character and wisdom. That's the issue around these topics that I'm interested in right now and that I'm pursuing in my thinking.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely resonate there. Yeah, I found, I study a combat art, it's Kali, Filipino Kali and Indonesian Silat. And, but I'm not a fighter, my, my primary impact from those arts and training those arts is pretty much exactly what you're talking about, is a deepening in all areas of life, this transference. So yeah, and I'm really when it comes to looking for practices that are holistically, bringing us deeper into our bodies, and having this kind of transference into our other areas of life. I think, I just keep thinking about the ecologies of practice. Search, looking for the like you said, there's different things. There's things that work in that way, and there's things that don't. So I think part of, a huge part of this seems to be the manner in which it's taught. I think it's up to the teacher in a way to be able to, I've been able to use, for example, with the primitive skills, which also have a deep a deep way of embedding you in your body and in the world, but pretty much use anything as a metaphor, as a way of getting people to connect to layers of themselves and layers of their journey, that they might not have done if they just built a fire. But you can allow it to be a symbol for all of these things and hold all this meaning, but so, and that kind of goes into the mentoring thing. That's a big part of our work too.
Well, the two come together. I don't know if you saw any of the conversations I had with Nick Winkleman on the
we did last night, actually.
The language of coaching, and how he uses enacted analogy and enacted metaphor in the coaching, right? I'm thinking of mentoring as having a coaching dimension to it. And then that goes back to my original example, because there was a way, there's a weird enacted metaphor, because in Tai Chi you're definitely training, sensory motor balance and flexibility, and you're opening up awareness. That itself is even a metaphor. And yet that was but that was the language people were using to describe my academic practice. It was becoming more open, more balanced, more flexible. And so there's this idea about, there's something in the practices, and then, like, I agree with you, there's something in the language of coaching or the language of mentoring that makes it transferable. And I'm not quite clear what it is. I've been exploring it with Nick. It's like, it's a combination of one thing is, why do certain metaphors catch so that the transfer occurs? And then the other thing is, why are certain practices good for transfer? And I'm trying to get some clarity on that. Is like what are the things that, so I have sort of some vague intuitions that what we need to do to make something transferable is it has to reach sort of some very fundamental overlap. Because there's the work of Tversky and others showing, I think we talked about this last time, that the machinery in the brain that we use for navigating physical space is the same machinery we use for navigating abstract conceptual space. And there's
Sure.
something about, right? Sorry, I'm stumbling here, but you can tell I'm really reaching, right? There's something about a core set of sensory motor, like metaphors that map, like there's sort of core sensory motor, the core cognitive grammar that's exapted from this sensory motor, and the metaphors tap that. And a practice is good if it is stereoscopic, if it pushes you down to that, pushes you up, and then it's good mentoring if it gives you the metaphorical bridge. Did that make any sense at all?
It absolutely does. Yeah. And, you know, one thing, so I'd be curious what you think about this is, I guess a couple things if I can hold on to it. One is I just call it the level of resolution at which you focus in terms of teaching. So I found that in learning and teaching all the practices that I do, but I focus on what I would call the operational principle level of teaching, you know. So it's something where, if you learn just a list of techniques, you are kind of stuck with a list of techniques. You don't
Right.
have a way to.
It's like a phrase book rather than a grammar.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So, however, if you have the why, you have the underlying principle of, this is about offset. What do you call it? Disrupting balance, or this is about
Right.
controlling range and stuff like that. These principles that are present in all kinds of movement and all kinds of space. There's a language around what I just referred to as principle. It's a concept principle level of teaching and training, that it's like going back to your optimal grip concept.
Yeah.
It really provides a place where I can kind of hold any of the contexts that I run into. I can find the appropriate place to interact with them through the principle of the thing, instead of through a specific tool or technique or trick that I've been taught. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Let me see if I understand you. So I like this notion of an operational principle. Is that the term you use?
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe it's an operating principle. I don't know which one.
Yeah.
Either one's fine. Okay, great. And then what I heard you say, if I was to use a little bit more theoretical language, is these principles are sort of meta optimal grip. What they are, and that'll give you an analogy, which seems appropriate. What they are is they help you in different contexts find an optimal grip. Is that okay?
That's right.
And so what that reminds me of, because this is how I often, what I often describe when you take a stance. The way I think of, you don't actually use a stance in anything. The point about a stance is it's like, if I want to go here or here or here or here, this is the best place from which I can get to all those other places. So you get people to see what's going, like to actually feel what's going on in the stance. And then that gives them it's like a node, that gives them access. So I think of the stance as practicing your meta optimal grip. Is that close to what you're talking about?
Very much. Yeah. So it's like a reference point from which you can go. Well, you call it multi-apt, right?
Yeah. It's multi-apt.
So another example, another analogy would be in our we have an angling system of strikes,
right.
12 angles of attack or 12 angles of defense, whatever. And it's like, first people think these, and they are. It's interesting how at the beginning you have to learn a form. You can't just go to principle land magically.
Yeah.
You need a structure to experience the principles to flow through, right? So we start with 12 angles, and so we have angle 1, which comes out of this quadrant right here, say. And really what I've kind of noticed is often it's taught, I use the analogy of the old model of the atom, the kind of small solar system.
Yeah. I've been using that analogy recently myself. Go ahead.
Okay. So the angle 1 to me is like imagining the atom as a solar system. Here's where the electrons are. It gives you a place to kind of imagine what might come out of this place, right? But in reality, and I don't understand quantum physics, but I get somewhat the reference of the probability field. You know, it's nothing like those discrete particles.
Yeah.
You know, so the angle 1 could be anything that comes out of this space over here, but it gives your body a way to map kind of onto
Yes.
that space potential. You know, so anyway, yeah, there's finding the and I've been thinking about the structural functional organization in your
Right.
language. To me, it sounds a lot by what I mean by principles. Almost
I
like
see. Yeah.
like the design behind the thing, you know, the blueprint. But
Right.
so anyway, if what I actually do is I'll focus on, you know, there's numerous important principles always at work. I also see them as constraints, I suppose, would be another way to.
Oh, yeah. And that would map into sort of structural functional organization.
Would it? Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Okay. Yeah. So we were going on, yeah, focusing on that level of, I just call it resolution. Like you could look at technique, you could look at strategy, but that's a little too deep in a way,
Yeah.
too abstract. But I come back to principles, and it seems to be, whether I'm teaching someone to make a fire, you know, I go back to the fire triangle of friction, you know, heat, oxygen, and the hidden one there is structure as well. You know, having the fire has to have a shape that works. But when people can relate to these skills and processes that way, they have room to kind of develop their own relationship, because they're just managing the principles rather than trying to solve a checklist, you know. So
well, that's my friend Leo Ferraro. That's where I got the analogy from. He said, you teach people the grammar rather than teaching them a phrase book, right?
Yeah.
You have to teach. You have to start by teaching them like phrases and vocabulary, but eventually there's enough material within which you can teach them the grammar, and then once they learn the grammar, then they get this amazing capacity to generate what they need when they need it.
Yeah. That's what has attracted me to your work. I know, because I've trained myself to find principle-based teaching, and as soon as I zeroed in on what you're doing, I'm like, oh yeah,
that's exactly right. Trying to find that meta optimal grip around the virtual engines, the structural functional organizations that, you know, well, for me, what they do is they have an enormous capacity to draw evidence in for trustworthiness, and then they have an enormous multi-aptness of application. And when I get that right, I like your metaphor. When I get the right resolution in which that happens, that's from we're sort of answering the question I posed. That's very helpful. I just realized. Yeah. So when we get one of the ways of seeing if we found the right structural principles is that they should be able to draw in diverse evidence that makes them trustworthy, and then they should have, you know, diverse application, multi-aptness that makes them powerful.
Yeah. So that does seem like kind of what you're talking about. I mean, if you find, because I mean, would you say, well, actually, I'd be curious on how you would define a principle. I can tell you what I've come up with, but I see in the way we're talking about it. I mean,
well, I mean, for me, if you allow me the language, for me, it's a principle is a structural functional organization that affords deep understanding by doing exactly that. Like you have a lot of convergence evidence for it, and then you have a lot of elegant application from it.
Okay, cool. That's what I was hoping to make that connection. Good. So how does that relate to constraints? I mean, I just, can you clarify that? I mean, I can sense it.
Well, one of the ways in which you create a structural functional organization is, well, maybe always, but I hadn't thought about it that way. I mean, what you're doing to get a structure is you have enabling constraints and selective constraints. So a structural functional organization is the result of a process, I would argue, of complexification, in which you're simultaneously differentiating and integrating, like the way the zygote differentiates and integrates, right? And so a structural functional organization is a result of complexification. And the way you get complexification is you have to have processes that are differentiating, introducing variation, and then processes that are introducing some selection on it. So even in like a drawing that's a structure, you have different parts in different dimensions, or at least different locations in the same dimension, and that's the differentiation. I'm doing a square here, obviously, but then they're integrated together. Like there's selective constraints. They have to all touch each other. They have to all be straight, etc. Things like that. So I think when you were talking about constraints, we're talking about the dynamics by which structural functional organization emerges, the dynamics of complexification. When we're talking about structural functional organization, we're talking about, right, we're pointing to the resulting pattern that causes the thing to behave as a integrated whole and makes it intelligible to us as an integrated whole.
Wow. Yeah, that is.
Does
cool.
that help?
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm gonna have to think about that some more. You know, what you're describing now, I feel like this kind of has part of the solution as to why it's so transferable. Is you're describing, I mean, focusing on principles is so transferable. You're describing what isn't it the process of learning itself also the process of evolution itself?
I would argue that. I mean, I think relevance realization is analogous, at least at one level of analysis, is analogous to evolution, and Siegler and other people have got evidence for that within child development. It's at the heart of the deep learning algorithm. So yeah, I think it's fundamental. The way I would connect that, and this is a book I'm working on with my son, is that yeah, and here's where we again, and I'm not quite sure how the mapping works here. We could maybe explore it together. So yeah, there's the language of training, there's the language of explaining, and there's also a distinction between knowledge and understanding. Again, they're not completely distinct. They're analytically distinct. Doesn't mean they're causally distinct, right? But a lot of work's being done on this right now, and I think a big part of pedagogy is about understanding, not the transmission of knowledge. Those aren't the same thing. The way people talk about this, at least in the psychological literature, the philosophy of science literature, is understanding is the ability to grasp the significance of what you know, which is different from knowing it. Knowing it is to grasp the evidence for it or something like that, whereas understanding is to grasp the significance of it. And what we've been talking about with application is more about understanding. And so if we're thinking about learning, like there's the learning of there's the learning that gives us understanding, and then there's the learning that in which we acquire knowledge. Again, these are analytically and not causally distinct. I'll keep saying that. But when we're concentrating on this question about application, I think we're talking the pedagogy of understanding. We're talking about how do we get it so people understand what they know. No, then that can itself be something that they know, like it layers up recursively, right?
Yeah.
But so I think it is about learning when we're talking about, right, especially when we're talking about the learning that leads to understanding. And I think the learning that leads to understanding has a lot more to do with the language of training. Explaining matters, but training is typically the language we use in order to get people. So that's why we use the metaphors. We're not giving people new propositions. We pretend to, but what we're actually doing is giving propositions that are not literally true. We give people propositions that change what they find salient and relevant, because we're trying to afford understanding. So I think we're talking more about the language of training when we're talking about understanding. So let me give you an example. I'll use your example. That the Bohr model of the atom.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we teach that to people? It's false. We teach it to people not because it's knowledge. It's not knowledge. It's false. And by definition, if it's false, it can't be knowledge. We teach it because it helps people get an understanding that they need in order to grasp the significance of the true propositions we're telling them about the atom.
So interesting. Yeah. Metaphorically true. Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to, I appreciate what you when you're saying that, but I'm trying to. So I'm not pushing back on you, but I want to push back on that topic. It's floating around right now, metaphorical truth. And I kind of think that's the wrong way of thinking of it. Can I have a moment about this, or?
Yeah.
So let me try and use something that's analogous. So I consider myself a non-theist. I don't know if you've seen any of that. Whereas I think I reject the shared assumptions of literalism, sorry, of atheism and theism. And I think we have to break out of that to come into a relation. I'm not here to argue that. I'm just saying that's a move, and there's a lot of history around it. Many mystical traditions converge on this, etc. I want to propose something similar with the idea of the non-literal. Non-literal is that which transcends the dichotomy between the literal and the metaphorical. And so let me try and give you an example of what I mean. When I said that something, that relevance realization, right, and evolution, they're analogous, but that's not just a metaphorical truth. They are both actually, and here's where we can get back to our earlier discussion, and we can bring in Aristotle. We have two processes that participate in the same principle, right?
Yeah.
The principle of variation and selection in order to get a self-organizing system to evolve to more appropriately fit its environment. Now, was that a literal thing I said, or a metaphorical? Well, it's, and I find this in the Neoplatonic tradition. It's like, no, I'm not saying that this is like this, right? I'm saying that these two things both participate in a higher thing that they belong to. And I think a lot of this language, some of it is just metaphorical. I'm not denying that. But I think when we get into some of the deeper aspects of this, like we were talking about the generating understanding, I think we might want to think that sometimes when it's deeper, we're doing non-literal rather than metaphorical or literal. We're not mapping between two domains. Literally, it's an identity mapping, right? And then metaphorical, it's a non-identical mapping, and then there's all this controversy. But what about if both map into something else? What if they share a common ancestor? They share a common ontological ancestor, and that's what we're actually trying to point to. Because I see that all the way through the Neoplatonic tradition, and therefore their understanding of analogy is actually very different than our modern understanding of analogy. If you look at people like Nicholas of Cusa, so he would say, he'd do this thing like this. He'd say, so if I take a circle and I make the circle bigger, the arc of the circle is getting more and more flat. Do you see that as the circle is getting bigger? So if I have an infinite circle, it's also a straight line, which is right, and which is a contradiction. And then he would say, and that's how God is. Right? These two things somehow participate in something beyond them. There isn't a metaphorical relationship between the flat line and the circle. You triangulate through them to something that they both participate in. And so I'm interested, I guess, sorry, I'll try to bring this around, in how the application is not only sort of out into our lives, but how it can help us move up and down in our ontology, if that makes any sense.
Would that be developmentally, or ontology is meaning? Is that right?
Ontology has to do with, sorry, I apologize. Ontology is the study of the structure of being, the structure of reality. So when you're moving up and down levels of reality, that's what I'm talking about. Because I think what's happening in some of the applications is it's not only that's what I was trying to get, when I was trying to use these two dimensions. It permeates through your life, but it also percolates between levels of your psyche. It goes down to very physical, but it also percolates up to the very spiritual. That's what I'm trying to sort of point to.
Yeah. Do you think it's, so going back to the principal level of resolution, looking at that level, do you think it's that there are specific principles that do that actually go in both those dimensions.
Yeah,
Or
yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, so, and I mean, that's why we have all these cross symbols,
yeah,
universal, because when we find, so, Aristotle talked about phronesis, which is your capacity to adapt to different contexts, right? But he also talked about Sophia, which was your ability to move to the various levels, right? And the point was to always have an appropriate dialogue, dialogos even, between Sophia and phronesis. So you want principles that would take you up to God and connect, the ladder of heaven, but also, so vertical principles, right? But they also horizontally project through different domains of your life. And I think that one way of understanding religion, I hope this doesn't piss religious people off, is the search for imaginal practices. Imagine the imaginary is in your head. The imaginal, you enact it. It's the difference between a kid picturing a sailboat and a kid pretending to be Superman by tying a blanket around and moving around, right? So religion, and what you can do is you can use the imaginal to augment reality, like in a heads-up display, right? Or Go Pokemon, or the way the scientists use the data from the Mars rovers, they color it and they mark it all up in order to see into it. So imaginal augmented reality that allows us to search for principles that have both high and have extremely high vertical application and extremely broad horizontal application. Religion is the use of imaginal augmentation to search for exactly those principles.
Wow, that's interesting. That's a very cool way to.
I don't know, eh? It's at least it's at least a thought-provoking proposal, perhaps, right?
Yeah. One of my influences has been because I haven't been an academic philosopher, but I've kind of took the what do you call it? The shortcut through Ken Wilber, because he kind of integrated all of these things together.
Yeah.
He kind
of does that for a lot of people in your history.
Yeah, it was very, very useful stepping stone for me. But his basically summarizes, it sounds like what you're talking about in terms of depth and span, like looking for optimal depth and optimal span, finding that space.
Right.
Anyway, that's the language I've been using. But
I think that's right. I think we're saying the same thing. As long as we understand that optimal grip, and you go back to Merleau-Ponty and Polanyi, is dynamic. There isn't a place that is always the optimal grip. It is always relative to the task and the environment and the person.
Right. Dynamic, like a frame of reference, almost like a.
I
think of a frame as something that, like my camera, whatever I'm looking at through is still constrained by the frame. Basically, it's my.
If you make it a moving thing, if your camera can adjust, right, right, and you can do weird things with that, like the Hitchcock thing. Forget what it was called. Hitchcock invented the thing where you pull back, but so you move the camera back, but you focus in, so you get that weird thing where the person looks like they're standing still, but the background is changing behind them. Yeah.
Interesting. There was another piece to the way the principal language was answering one of those questions. I can't remember what it was though.
Well, I can say one thing while you're looking, if you don't mind. I mean, I'm very interested in how you are. I mean, you're doing this ecology practice. I remember what we talked about last time, and you're trying. To my understanding, I see you I see you nesting things. So the martial arts, right, can do this to a certain degree, but then they need to be nested into a practice that has more vertical reach and horizontal reach, right? And am I understanding you correctly? Is that? And so I'm really interested in that nesting issue as well.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. I love that. I think where that was, I call it a container that kind of holds that was given to me was through a model of we'll call it the directional model, or they used to call it the medicine wheel of
Yep.
life.
Yep.
And man, I've just found that. Now, actually, I'm just curious, would that be, I can kind of consider that a psychotechnology. Would that be appropriate?
I think so. I mean,
Okay.
is it a socially standardized practice that can be taught and internalized and broadly applied,
Yeah.
and it alters your information processing, your framing of problems? Then for me, that's a psychotechnology.
Okay. So yeah, I think it fits that category, and it's been man, such a useful tool. And what I found is, again, looking at it from a principle level, it itself, I ended up forming a relationship with it that I discovered. I'm like, wait, this is actually patterning my mind and my body in a certain way. This
Yeah.
is not just a tool that I have hanging on the wall that I go reference. This is something that affects how you perceive the world.
It's internalizable. That's also a defining feature of a really good psychotechnology.
Okay. Yeah. So, and what it does is, it seems like it allows you to perceive things relatively simultaneously in various dimensions. And you're always looking for, kind of like, well, yin yang would be a
Yeah.
binary. Well, I know it's more complex than that, but it'd be a
Yeah.
binary example of that, right? Where you can kind of sort reality through these two
Yeah.
polarities and their relationships. And so the medicine wheel, that I mostly use is 8 directions, but often it's called the 7 arrows. So it represents a 4-dimensional, I'm sorry, 2-dimensional 4 directions, and then a 3rd dimension gives you a 3rd axis, basically XYZ axis.
Yeah. Right.
And then so that gives you a 3D kind of experience with this thing. So then you have so you have 2 dimensions, or the crosshairs, which gives you the 4 domains of life, or 4 domains of whatever you want to look at.
Right.
And then you have the depth through that 3D axis.
Right.
So that gives you technically 6 directions, with center being 7,
Right.
And I found that interesting, by the way, that a lot of things organize around 7,
Yeah.
especially in these old traditions, and wondering if that has anything to do with the kind of the bandwidth constraint of 7 plus or minus 2. That was one of my hypotheses about that. We might have just discovered, yeah, we can remember 7 things. How interesting to, we can hold on to 7 things at once.
Yeah. If they're properly chunked. We now think the base number is actually 4. You can sort of hold four unchunked, like 4 separate chunks, right?
Okay.
But if you
Well,
typically what you did is that they're because the 7 are not completely, they're more like a telephone number, because people used to chunk the telephone number into a group of 3 and a group of 4, right?
Right. Yeah. So, well, that's actually interesting. So that would bring up a lot of the 4s that we see as well.
Yeah.
Directions.
That's right.
So anyway, what I did is I used that as a container, and the 7 arrows.
What do they do for you? Yeah, please.
So, actually, let me make this simpler. We just take the 4 directions. Is that on your screen? Okay.
Yeah.
That gives us 4 different dimensions, and what I use is, oh man, this is so interesting. The 4. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to convey too much, because
It's okay.
This has a lot of meaning for me. It's really,
well, a lot. I mean, I think what it is a lot has been a lot has converged and compressed into it, and you see it having lots of application. So I get that.
Yeah. So just give me a sec. So
please.
So on one axis, basically what I did was, one of my teachers through the I call it the tracker school, basically this whole lineage of primal skills, basically kind of distinguish these 4 archetypes, or these 4 skill sets of humanity, these 4 needs essentially that those archetypes are representing, and the skills are answering. And they were basically tracking, survival, healing, and combat. Okay.
Did they map onto the 4
They
quadrants?
do, yeah. So tracking,
Right.
survival, healing, and combat.
Right.
Okay, and that's the way I organize them. Now, already these dimensions, these directions, have a representational meaning loaded. They're like preloaded,
Right.
and
Right.
that's
Right.
something that the medicine wheel provides. I'll explain that in a sec. I don't know how far you want to go into this, but I'm happy.
I want to go
explain.
quite far. I want to understand how this works.
Okay, so these are all what I've found is these are all chunked relatively at a similar scale of resolution. So
Right.
survival and combat, in other words, are comparable in kind of how the things that they bring up in your mind are similar. If I said, I don't know, firearms and survival, that wouldn't quite work. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
you want to find these paths or these directions, these themes that are relatively similar in wholeness
Right. Right.
and what they hold. So these can be found today. These are still all represented in as the primal arts of humanity. We have tracking would be like the media, the people that are information gatherers, the
Right.
scientists, yourself.
Right.
Survival would cover all of the living needs, the shelter, water, fire, food,
Right.
mechanics, those people. Healing's obviously the infrastructure for healing, and then our defense and protective structures, right? So these things are all still with us, but one of my kind of, I don't know, metrics, or one of my points of reference is what I just call the primal human level. So it's primal in another sense. So there's obviously the primal, which is essential, original, fundamental, that kind of primal. And that's
Right.
That's what I look for in terms of principles for teaching.
Right.
But there's also primal in terms of human, the way we think of it that way, which would be kind of our longest lived way of being, which we can kind of assume is hunter-gatherer.
Yeah.
So small groups of people, relatively low technology, simple technology, and that scale. So, and that's a lot of where I learned. That's the level of skills that were passed on to me through this kind of training. So that's kind of another reason that really became important to me. And it seems to be a really good reference. I keep taking stuff back to that. I'm like, well, let's look at this ancestrally. And you hear that.
I mean, everybody has that wired into their evolutionary heritage in their brain. So it's a point at which you can touch all people, at which people can all connect.
There's primal in another sense, yeah. So and we have the most momentum from that programming. I mean, we've lived that way for how long, compared to how we are now. So okay, so here's the 4 domains. These are what I call the hard skills, or the science of the primal arts.
Right.
And each of them is a life path if you really wanted to pursue it, obviously. I mean,
right.
So, but now so I'm just going to connect these.
Right.
And outside of that, as a supporting skill set, what I found, I kind of added this second layer. So anyone that's interested in one of these skills or arts, let's say tracking, for example, when you begin to get into tracking, one of the things that you pretty quickly run into is yourself, because of the nature of training,
right.
And especially tracking, because it's around how you perceive the world and perception. You run into your own limitations and your own biases and all this stuff really quickly.
Right.
So, and this isn't like literally doing the hard skills, because you'll be out with someone and be like, well, they're seeing stuff, I'm not seeing stuff. What am I missing? And then all this kind of internal
right. That's cool.
Processing starts happening. So as a supporting, and I refer to this as the primal journey in terms of training as we go around this through the seasons. Now you can be doing all of these all the time, but we start in the springtime with tracking, for example. And now I'm referring to the medicine wheel again, because The east
Yeah.
over here
Yeah.
is spring
Right.
in that metaphor, summer, fall, winter. And so there's a lot of other meanings embedded in that behind the scenes in the medicine wheel itself. And maybe I'd like to just explain one more layer, and then I'll go
Please.
explain medicine wheel a little bit more.
Yeah.
Just after container. So you have the science or the skills level of training of focus, which is awesome and great, and these are very important skills, blah blah blah. But they are, you only can go as far as in them in each direction as you are able to go. And if you run into yourself and you become the block, often people will either just kind of quit, or they'll lose interest, or they'll get stuck or something like that. So what there seems to be needed is a corresponding training that deals with the basically developmental learning process itself.
Right.
You know? And so
Yeah.
I call that, let's put another color, but so supporting that on the outside is another series of training, and I have classes that correspond to each of these. So
Right.
the class over here that corresponds to tracking, I just call the path, and it's about kind of stepping onto a path and how to use it, and how
Right.
to
Right. I see the metaphor transfer. Yeah.
the freedom through constraints also shows up there.
Yeah.
And then we get into the tools in survival, which is all about the practices that help support the journey of nature connection. And so it's, meditation, sit spot, and journaling. And
Right.
things. And then a class here, this sounds pretentious, but I call it the way, which is really about the way of transformation, the process of overcoming and doing the work. And finally, the zone, which is the one I'm actually kind of
right.
Which is about kind of the peak experiences and kind of the payoff, if you will, of journeying, right?
Yeah.
And then it cycles back, and it doesn't cycle, but it spirals, right? So it's always
and so people are always doing training at these two levels, like they're doing the, in your diagram, the inner circle. They're moving around that in sort of a pedagogical program where one stage affords the next, and then they're also doing this higher level thing at the same time, and they're doing them in parallel. Is that the idea? Something like that?
Something like that. It's a little more organic. It's kind of I just let people get attracted to whatever they get attracted to.
I see.
And then that becomes the funny thing is, because there's also this, right? Which is I jokingly say I just teach one thing, and what I really teach is how to journey.
Right.
And so it all comes back to that, and it just depends on where people's interests and passions are, as to what they get kind of pulled into. So, but yeah, simultaneously those are operating. So you have the skill development, but you also have the learning development that's supporting the skills.
Right.
And then there's one more layer, which is when I contact you about know thyself, which is I would say almost like I call it the tribe series. It's about the people. It's about human to human relations. So it's know thyself, team dynamics, creating community, and then mentoring leadership. And so those are kind of a continuum as well of the idea being, if we have individuals that are, seeking to know themselves and seeking wisdom, what do you know, when those come together, they make really good teams.
Right.
Teams are actually a functional, actionable unit within communities that get stuff done, and then communities often need some sort of a way to preserve and transmit knowledge. So you have the elders or the mentors that are
the ratcheting across generation.
So, and that's not my invention. I mean, that's kind of my distillation, but it's all comes from this ancient model of culture, really.
Right.
And so
this is actually, I mean, this is in the language, this is imaginal. This is not an image in your head. This is this is one you're using to organize your experience of the world and organizing your development within it. Is that right?
Yeah, Yeah, you know what? To such a degree, it's really interesting that I've been doing this for about like this for probably 15 years, and I've found that month to month, my relevance realization, like what I'm sorting
Yeah,
for in the world, actually is high. It just organically starts to teach me through that lens because I've
yeah,
spent so many done so many reps on this. So I'll this like what do you know this month if I didn't get a lot of insight on mentoring and leadership without even trying,
right, right.
it's just how
Like
my
the
life.
church calendar.
Yeah, it's my calendar. So
No, but I mean, the church had a church calendar
pardon?
where the church had a liturgical calendar. I mean, the
Okay.
Christian church in general.
Okay.
At different points of the year, you moved to different and sort of mental states, different frameworks,
Yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
much like that, and you cycled
Okay.
around. There was the liturgical year that was supposed to be different from the profane year.
Wow, that's really interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah,
Very good.
yeah, creating these cycles also goes back to sort of a pre-axial way of thinking, the cyclical cosmos, as
Yeah,
opposed to the linear progress through history. Yeah.
yeah. Um, do you want me to explain a little bit more about the medicine wheel? How are we doing for time, by the way?
I only have about 5 more minutes, actually, unfortunately, but this
Okay,
has been really, really cool.
let me, yeah, this will actually tie into one more question I have for you. So let me take these off.
So to me, that strikes the way you keep learning from it. It's become sacred to you.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And part of the sacredness, going back to the principle conversation, was being able to finally, because I learned it as a form, I learned it like
yeah,
here's what the directions mean,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
that's kind of in our language we call that like a coyote teaching, which means it's not complete, there's more
yeah,
to it, it's a mystery.
yeah,
And what I've found is it becomes kind of like we were talking about with martial arts, the projecting those 12 angles
yeah,
into your world as a possible,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
mechanism
The same
to
thing.
understand.
That's
Yeah,
exactly what I was thinking. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So this question mark here, I've learned to, it's just life itself. It's just the unfolding context of whatever's happening. You have these four archetypes that you've trained within you that basically can catch and respond to most human needs,
yeah, yeah,
and depending on what's going on, you can kind of move into action.
yeah. It's like the stance, like the stance.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like the stance. Yeah.
yeah. That's
So
very cool, Ben. That is very
thank
cool.
yeah, it's been pretty amazing. So, um, but one of the things I found, and this is one question I wanted to ask you, was the pattern that shows up here is there's the points I drew on here, the different
Yeah,
directions. But traditionally, like, so you have, in the East, there's also, it corresponds with sunrise,
yeah,
corresponds with springtime, it
right.
corresponds with, right? So you get these different um,
Yeah,
kind of,
you're layering a lot of things on. That's what I mean about non-literal. They're not metaphors for each other. They're all participating in some
yeah,
deeper underlying principle.
yeah. And so, well, here's what I've just, in spending time with this, what you develop is a connection to a relationship, not just the thing. So it's no longer about spring or
Right?
sunrise or anything. It's the dotted line in between. It's the
Yeah,
connective
yeah,
thing.
exactly. That's what I mean by the non-literal.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly what I'm pointing to.
Okay. So that thread, and I'm just calling it the relationship,
That's fine.
or the correspondence itself,
Yeah,
actually becomes, for lack of better words in our language, we call it like an energy. Like it
yeah,
has
yeah.
its own, right?
It has a life of its own. Yeah,
Has a life of its own. Yeah. And that thing becomes universal. You can now map that onto anything, right? So
that is wickedly cool.
yeah, it's
That is
pretty amazing.
very,
So
oh wow, I'm so glad we did this.
yeah. So my question for you is, are relationships real things? Because I've been experiencing life in a way that I'm starting to see relationships as almost being fundamental, if not at least
I think
simultaneously.
I think they are. I think these non-literal relationships, these patterns, right? Um, I'm not I'm not I'm not totally clear or absolutely confident about what I'm about to say, but I recommend you reading Thomas is it Thomas? Yeah, I think it's Thomas Morton. Anyway, it's Morton, or is it Timothy Morton? Last name Morton. His book Hyperobjects, and he's from speculative realism, and he's a sort of deep ecologist, philosopher. So he talks about things like global warming, hyperobjects, that they're not at human scale, but nevertheless they're real, and they're not sort of spatio-temporally bound. And it's right, and we never experience them right in their total. We only experience what he calls manifestations of them. And I think our ability, and I think one of the things we do with distributed cognition, this is something I'm pursuing with Dan Chappie, is we use distributed cognition either synchronously between people or diachronically across traditions, right? We use distributed cognitions to track, using your language, hyperobjects. And I think those non-literal patterns that we're talking about now, the layering patterns that again permeate, right, and percolate, I think those are hyperobjects in this sense. Things like evolution and global warming are hyperobjects in a really important way. They have a reality that is neither the reality of mathematical principles like E equals MC squared, nor are they the kind of reality we attribute to spatio-temporal objects, but they're nevertheless real. Because if you don't believe evolution is real, you're in a real mess explaining how you got here and things like that, right?
Right.
And so that, and what sorry for interrupting, just one more point, because it goes towards something we were talking about, learning the wisdom, the discernment to get that right framing that allows you to get the right optimal grip resolution so that you can relate to the realness of the hyperobjects is something that, well, I think he's arguing we need to do, for example, in order to address the ecological challenges like global warming that we're facing right now. So I recommend his book to you, Hyperobjects.
I will check that out for sure. Thank you so much. Very cool. Well,
let's talk again soon. I want to continue this conversation. And I would really like to put this on Voices with Vervaeke. If you could send me a copy of this.
Absolutely, I will do. Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for your time. And
well, thank you, Ben. This was so much food for thought. I want to do more, because I like the way this moved from you interviewing me to us dialoguing together. I'd like to do another one soon where we continue that process, if that would be okay with you.
Of course, yeah. I'll kind of leave it up to you and your schedule, but I'll put out a reminder for you. So
please do.
right on. Thank you. Have a good day.
Take good care.